These recordings of President Truman are taken from a series of conversations we had in 1963 and 64. He was then in his 79th year. One day, we were discussing his consuming interest in books, and that brought us around to our basic subject, the presidency.
When I was growing up, from the time I could read books, I was an avid reader because I had to wear spectacles. I was always afraid to get them broken and tear out the little sight that I had. So I spent most of my time, except when I was being an umpire to a backlot baseball game, where they always had me the umpire because I couldn't see. So I spent my time reading. I read the books in the Independence Library, all of them, 3,000 volumes, including the encyclopedia, and some of them twice. And I've got about that many in the library at home now. That's this historical library on the presidency. I've read all the books in that place, and that's what we're putting this thing on for, is to give somebody, some people, the idea of what they've got and how they ought to act to keep it. And you'd be surprised how many ignoramuses there are in this country when it comes to talking about the presidency of the United States.
Before we talk about the presidency, sir, I'd like to talk about you, your background. Let's start with the family album. This one is your father?
The hardest working man that ever lived. He raised my brother and myself to believe that honor is worth more than money. And that's the reason we never got rich, none of us. This is a picture of my mother, taken at the same time the picture of my father was taken on the day they were married. She was considered in her day one of the most beautiful women in the county. She taught us all our Sunday school lessons, started us at Sunday school and took us nearly every Sunday. And believe it or not, we were all Baptists, but we went to school at the Presbyterian Sunday school because it was closer to the house where we lived. She was a wonderful mother also. Honor was the first rule with her as it was with my father. That's a picture of Mrs. Truman. She had the prettiest blue eyes and golden hair you ever saw. She still has in my book. She and I went to Sunday school together when she was 5 and I was 6. She doesn't like for me to tell that because everybody knows how old I am. She and I went through all the schools together and through high school together and have practically been together ever since. And it's a great satisfaction to a person when he's happily married and has a happy family.
Mr. President, in 1945, you suddenly and unexpectedly became President of the United States. The war at that time had just been won in Europe, but we were still fighting in Japan. And you had to go as a novice in world affairs to Potsdam. You had to meet Stalin and Churchill, whom you had never met before. How did you feel going into such a momentous conference that soon?
When I went to Potsdam, I thought I could get along with Stalin. He was easy to make an agreement with, and he didn't argue much, and we had just finished winning one of the greatest world wars in history as partners and allies. And I made up my mind that it wouldn't be any trouble to get along with Stalin. How mistaken I was. The old bastard would make agreements and break them the next day. And I didn't like that kind of business. He was quite a man, though, and ran the Soviet government. Whenever he spoke, they jumped. Making any difference how big they were, and he was a little bit of a squirt. Whenever he had his picture taken with me, he stood up on a step above me so he'd be on a level with me. And he and Churchill used to have more arguments than anybody else when we were together over there at Potsdam. But in the long run, we finally got what we wanted, made 32 agreements, and it made 16 at Yalta, and he broke every single one of them. What are you going to do with an outfit like that? When you're in business, and you're doing business with a good firm, you have to have confidence in their word and their signature. We couldn't have any confidence in this old man right here. He didn't mind who he double-crossed. First thing they did after they met, the three, was to have me made the chairman because I was the only head of a state that was present. The other two were prime ministers of their countries. But they represented their countries just the same as I represented mine. Churchill was always long-winded. He liked to talk about everything that came up for a long time. Stalin one day leaned on his elbow and said, Mr. Prime Minister, why don't you agree? The Americans and we agree, and there's no use making a speech about everything. I'm willing to make a speech if you do, but I think we'd get along faster if you didn't talk so much. And then we went on from there. Stalin, Churchill, and I discussed everything nearly under the sun. We particularly talked about refugees. They were trying to get out of Poland, out of Czechoslovakia and Sudetenland, into Germany, where the British and the Americans would feed them. Stalin said it didn't exist. When I asked him what had happened to the refugees from East Prussia, he said there weren't any there when we got there. And of course he was lying to me. Finally, Stalin did say that something should be done for the refugees. And we finally got an agreement so that the refugees could be moved out of Czechoslovakia and Poland. And even at that, though, the Allies had to feed them and see that they were sheltered and take care of them.
During the conference, the election in England replaced Churchill with Clement Attlee as Prime Minister. How did that affect the political climate of your meeting?
When Churchill was defeated in the election, Attlee was ready and willing to carry on because he was familiar with everything that had taken place. But we lost 2 days because Stalin pretended that he was sick. I don't think he was sick. I think he was sore because the Labour Party had won in England. He didn't like the Labour Party because they were putting the communists out of business in England. Not that they had any communist ideas, but that the people liked the liberal Labour Party much better than the crooked communists. And Stalin, I'm sure, was put out because Attlee was the prime minister who was going to continue with the conference. I finally got tired of all the bickering and conversation and told them that I was going to pack up and go home, that I didn't come over there to talk. I came over there to get action. And if they wanted to get action, I'd stay. Stalin kind of laughed and said he'd like to go home, too. In spite of the gravity of the situation with which we were faced, diplomatic niceties had to be gone through. And it was necessary, just as it had been at Yalta, for each of the countries to have a state dinner for the entertainment of the other two. My turn came first. I had a young man with the name of Liszt, who is now a concert pianist in this country. He played several Chopin pieces. I knew that Stalin liked Chopin. Churchill was bored with the whole performance. At any rate, we went out to thank the young man, so we went out on the side porch where the orchestra was playing, where he'd been playing the piano, and like scared the boy to death. He thought we were going to cut his head off or something. Stalin had to put on one. And he brought a couple of pianists from Moscow. He also brought a couple of sopranos, very big, fat women with wonderful voices who also helped to entertain us. Stalin's party was a wing-ding, a good one. He was trying to outdo the American in his party. At Stalin's dinner, he kept drinking out of a bottle. Everybody else was drinking vodka, or trying to. It's hard to get down, you know, if you're not used to it. At any rate, I turned around to him and I said, that must be a different brand you're drinking. He had a little glass about the size of a thimble. I reached over and took his bottle and poured it in my vodka glass after it was empty, and it was French wine. He wasn't drinking vodka at all. And I said, you're putting one over on us, aren't you? Oh, well, he says, you know, my heart won't stand this heavy drinking, and I have to go slowly. Well, you know, the Russians never put on a dinner and without a whole raft of toasts. At the Russian state dinner at Potsdam, they had 14 toasts. And I learned early in the game not to take a drink every time they offered a toast, but just back out like you're taking one, because you would be unable to carry on the business of the meeting. And when we arrived at the end and wrote up the protocol, that is the agreement, they call it a protocol, and it was signed, Mr. Stalin asked me if he could sign first. He said, I've signed a half a dozen of these things, and I always get to sign last. I'd like to sign first this time. Well, he got to sign first. Mr. Attlee got to sign second, and I signed last as the presiding officer of the meeting. But it didn't make any difference whether Russians signed. They didn't keep their agreements. It wasn't worth the paper it was written on, but we didn't know that at the time.
Yet, when you were returning in the ship from that meeting, you did come to a very definite decision. Bernard Baruch said of that decision, "Let us not be deceived. Today we are in the midst of a Cold War." Could Potsdam have ended any other way?
The day I left Washington, I wrote my daughter Mardik a letter. And I want to read a line or two from the copy of that letter, which I have before me. And it said this: "There is an epitaph in Boot Hill Cemetery in Arizona, which reads, 'Here lies Jack Williams. He done his damnedest. What more can a person do?' Well, that's all I could do. I did my damnedest, and that's all there was to it."
And you went home from Potsdam knowing that it was up to the new President of the United States to deal with a very tentative peace. It was much easier being a senator, wasn't it?
I have made the statement several times. If I'd had my way, I'd just as lief to have been called Mr. Senator for the rest of my life. Become acquainted with the pick of the nation. You see, the senators are now elected at large in each state, too. And they have to be the outstanding men of those states. I don't say that I was, but then they elected me anyway. At any rate, I liked it better than any place I've ever been.
How does a new senator feel becoming part of this vital, august body?
I was worried because it's one of the most important jobs in the government of the United States. And while I was thinking about the situation, I went over and sat down in the seat of the Senate that had been assigned to me, and the Senate whip, who was J. Ham Lewis, came around to me and sat down beside me, and he said, "Harry, you worry like everything and wonder how in the world you got here for about 6 months. After that, you wonder how the rest of us got there." You don't know how right he was.
Yet you never had a college education. You certainly weren't a lawyer.
When I graduated from high school, I was very anxious for a college education. And my parents were very anxious for all three of the family, my brother and my sister and myself, to have a college education. But my father got into financial difficulties and we were not able to do it. I had my first job in a bank at $35 a month. I paid $5 a week for board and then usually ate a box lunch for 10 cents in a 5-cent picture show, and that's how I got acquainted with everything that was going on in the world.
And let's see. You paid 25 cents a month to join the National Guard, and the men elected you their officer, and you all went to France in World War I. In 1918, in Alsace, when my battery went out of fire for the first time, the first sergeant came riding up and said, "Run, fellas, run. They've got a bracket on us." A few German shells had been falling around us, and all of them ran away, but 5 or 6 of us. And my horse stepped in a shell hole and rolled over me when it fell down. And when I got up and found out what had happened to the fellows around the battery, I explained a few things to them in language that they could understand. In fact, I took the skin off of them when I got through with them. The last town I fired on was a little town called Hermiville, way over beyond the French front, and I put all the cooks, waiters, and bartenders in the battery on a great long lanyard and let them fire the last shot of the war at 15 minutes to 11. To become commander-in-chief eventually. In 1944, what happened when you tried to get your friend Jimmy Burns nominated as vice president when Franklin Roosevelt was running? When I got to Chicago, I went around to the various leaders of the organizations over the country, and I knew them all at that time.
and not a single one of them would agree to support Burns. And he said, if we can't have Henry Wallace, we want you. Well, I said, I'm not a candidate. I don't want to be vice president. And Bob Hannigan came up to see me. He said, I want you downstairs. He was the chairman of the committee and a close personal friend of mine, so I went downstairs with him. We went down to the 5th floor. While I was there, the phone rang, and it was President Roosevelt at San Diego, California. And he said, Bob, have you got that fellow lined up? Bob says, no, he's the contrariest Missouri mule I ever came in contact with. Well, the president said, when the president talked over the telephone, all I need to do is raise the window. He didn't need a phone to talk with you from one end of the country to the other. He said, do tell him, if he wants to break up the Democratic Party in the middle of a war and maybe lose that war, that's his responsibility. Well, I was floored. I was sunk.
Did you at all anticipate then that President Roosevelt would not live out his term?
A man would have been very foolish not to realize that President Roosevelt was a very sick man. It became perfectly obvious to me that due to President Roosevelt's health, I would eventually inherit the presidency.
In that case, he must have chosen you with extra special care. Do you think that he felt you would confine yourself to carrying out his policies?
Well, the difficulty with the change of presidents is that there has to be a change in administration, where every man in the country and every man in the world has a different set of ideas. And no matter how hard he may attempt to carry things out, he can't do it exactly as the other fellow would.
Andrew Johnson ran into a lot of trouble when he took over after President Lincoln's assassination. Lincoln was another hard man to follow.
One of the 6 or 8 great presidents of the United States. He saved the Union. Andrew Johnson was one of the most maligned men that was ever in the White House. He did everything he possibly could to carry out the policies of Lincoln. And I've always said that if Lincoln hadn't been shot, he would have been impeached just the same as they tried to impeach Andrew Johnson. No vice president is ever fully prepared to take over the tremendous office of the presidency. It was just 83 days between January the 20th and April the 12th when I had to take over that great office without very much preparation. I went over to Sam Rayburn's hideaway, his private office on the 1st floor of the Capitol building, to discuss some legislative matters and relax a little bit one afternoon. And when I arrived there was a call waiting for me from Steve Early, the president's secretary, for me to call him right back. I called him, and he said, I wish you'd come to the White House immediately and come in at the Pennsylvania entrance on the front of the White House at Pennsylvania Avenue. I thought I was going down there to meet the president. I didn't allow myself to think anything else. On that day of April the 12th, 1945, I reached the White House about 5:25 in the afternoon. I immediately went to Mrs. Roosevelt's apartment, and she met me, placed her hand on my arm and said, Harry, the president is dead. Mrs. Roosevelt and I stood silent for a while. I was stunned, waited a while, and then I said to Mrs. Roosevelt, what can I do for you? She said, there's nothing you can do for us. You're the one that's in trouble now. To this day, people still ask me how I felt when I learned that President Roosevelt had passed away and that I had become the President of the United States. That question is one which can't be answered in a phrase or two. That night, they had a Secret Service man down one hall and a Secret Service man down the other hall, and one standing in front of the door. And Margaret and Mrs. Truman began to cry on my shoulder and asked me if they were going to live under that sort of a circumstance from now on, and I told them I thought they would.
Sir, as president, the very first decision you had to make was whether we should continue with the arrangements already made for the first conference of the organization, which would later be called the United Nations. Do you still believe in its potential?
History has been full of bloodshed. Rome against Greece, the Mongols against Rome, the Germanic tribes against the Mongols, the Christians against what they call the infidels. Already, in 50 years of our existence, we'd had 2 world wars. We had hoped very much that the world had come to an age of reason when the United Nations was formed. We hoped that the United Nations eventually would create a situation where there'd be world law, and instead of slaughtering each other, we could settle things in the courts, just as they do in this country now.
The most important hope for the United Nations, of course, is that it will prevent an atomic war. Considering the emotional argument before and afterwards, Mr. President, why did you drop the first atom bomb?
My chief purpose was to end the war in victory, with the least possible loss of American lives. I never had any qualms about using an instrument that finally ended the war in which we'd had 250 or 300,000 of our youngsters killed and 700,000 of them maimed. Napoleon made the statement, the Lord was always on the side of the heaviest artillery. I had to make the decision as to whether the atom bomb was just another piece of artillery.
7 scientists wrote the paper called the Frank Report. One of them was the scientist Leo Szilard. They said that the dropping of an atomic bomb would be an international crime.
In order to commit a crime, there has to be a law against it. There was no law against the dropping of the atom bomb. Szilard, who's one of the scientists from Germany, was perfectly willing to have the bomb dropped on Germany, but he didn't want to drop it on the Japs. Let me read you some of the counter petition against Szilard written by the scientists. Are not the men of the fighting forces who are risking their lives for the nation entitled to the weapons which have been designed? In short, are we to go on shedding American blood when we have available means of speedy victory? No. If we can save even a handful of American lives, let us use the weapon now. Arthur Compton, who gave the official report of the committee in opposition to the Frank Report, said that if the bomb were not used, the world would not have any adequate warning as to what was to be expected if war should break out again. That was Arthur Compton, director of the Metallurgical Project, one of the key inventors in making of the bomb. He was a Nobel Prize winner and inventor of the mathematical formula called the Compton effect. Whatever that is, I hope somebody knows. I called for a poll to be taken among the scientists. I didn't want to have any doubts. It turned out that 87% of them voted to use the bomb in one situation or the other. And here's the figures right here. 87% for and 13% against. Some wanted to give the Japs more time to surrender. I'll tell you what President Franklin D. Roosevelt had to say when they started on the bomb. He said, "Pray God it works. It will save many American lives."
Then this was the basic measurement.
The Constitution of the United States is dedicated to the common defense. I had sworn to uphold and protect the Constitution of the United States, and I had no alternative but to enforce it.
Mr. President, early in 1947, a new face of the United States was turned to the world. You said then, I'll read it, "The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedom. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation." Now, this concept of leadership came to be called the Truman Doctrine. It reached first to Turkey and Greece.
When the British informed me that they were going to pull out of Greece, that made the decision all the harder. Should I or should I not use the moral suasion and the resources of the United States for the benefit of a foreign nation while we were at peace? If the communists got charge, the common people wouldn't have a chance in the world anyway, and they never have under a communist government because it's nothing but a totalitarian state. The government of the right in Greece was just a regular old monarchical government. And I figured that we'd better save the government in Greece and then reform the government after we had that done. The Russians were threatening to go in with troops. All I used to get the job done was to use words. I didn't want to start a war.
You sent a large naval detachment to the area in a show of force.
I knew Stalin from way back at the Potsdam Conference. We were having a conversation one day about government, and Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, who represented England at the conference, made the statement to Stalin that Poland ought to have a free government because most of the country was Catholic, and the Pope wouldn't like it if they didn't get a free government. Old Stalin leaned on his elbow and pulled that long mustache of his, and he said, "Mr. President, how many divisions has the Pope?"
The Truman Doctrine, then, involves us in all the world.
The objective was to make the whole world a fair and a good place to live. I wanted to do away with these revolutions and civil wars and things of that sort that are unnecessarily killing people off because a few factions couldn't agree with each other. I was anxious that the humblest man in the farthest corner of the earth should have a place to eat and a place to sleep and something to wear. And I was willing to expend every effort of which I was capable to get that done, no matter what the opposition had to say. We're trying with everything we have to encourage the development of the Earth's resources, things to eat and things to wear and places to live for the benefit of all the men everywhere. The foreign policy of the United States is the maintenance of peace in the world.
Mr. President, at the end of World War II, $17 billion was a lot of money. This was the price tag you set on the feeding and rehabilitation of Europe. Yet you did get the American people to approve this gigantic effort. I'm speaking, of course, of the Marshall Plan.
The job that I had to do was to convince the Congress that the $17 billion could be spent over a period of years in such a way that it would not take more than 3% of our national income to put it over. And there were two very strong isolationists in the Senate who were then in charge of the Republican Party, Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan and Taft of Ohio. Taft had a very keen mind. He was chairman of the Senate Committee on Education and Labor, and was a man who had the idea that the opposition in the House and Senate ought to oppose, and he lived up to that very religiously. The Secretary of State, General Marshall, and I discussed the whole situation. General Marshall had been invited to Harvard University to obtain a degree. There is very little publicity at Harvard. Harvard, being the highest high hat university in the country, is sometimes skipped by the newspapers, I think because the language is too high hat for them to understand. And I thought if General Marshall made the hit at Harvard that I thought he would make, the Congress would be easier to get along with. I thought very highly of General Marshall, and I'll tell you a story about him. I wanted him to go to China. And then I got on the telephone and called General Marshall, who was just moving into his home down in Virginia. And I said, "General, I want you to go to China for me. Will you do it?" He said, "Yes, Mr. President," and hung up on me. But he came up the next morning, and I said, "Why? Why did you shut me off? I thought you'd argue because I'd told you wouldn't have anything more to do. You could go and rest now." "Well," he said, "Miss Marshall and I were unpacking, and I wanted to break the news gently to her." And he said the radio was turned on full blast, and before I could get to her, the radio blared out, "General Marshall goes to China," and I was in the grease sure enough then. Had the same experience with him when I was making him Secretary of State. He was up in Michigan, Honey. I called him up, and he was 15 miles to the telephone. He drove over to the telephone, and I told him that I'd like him, when he came back, to be Secretary of State of the United States. "Will you do it?" He says, yes, Mr. President, and did the same thing to me. And I said, now what the hell was the matter this time? Ms. Marshall wasn't there this time. Well, he said, this was in a country store, the telephone hanging on a post. And he said they had a big iron stove, and the fellows who chewed tobacco and spit on the stove were sitting around there with their ears cocked to see what was going to happen to General Marshall, and I wasn't going to let them know. I now had a plan for the rehabilitation of Europe, a plan based on self-help, not help yourself. It was named the Marshall Plan because of his wonderful speech at Harvard University. I knew what America had to do. We had to send help right away. If we failed, the people would starve. I was very much afraid that this Republican majority in the Congress would prevent me from ever having a chance to do what we set out to do. At this juncture, General Marshall asked the $40 question. Would it be necessary to take Russia into partnership in this? We had to make the offer, made the offer on the level to the whole of Europe.
The Russians refused to help. Why?
Communism grows out of human misery and poverty and nothing else. Get rid of misery and poverty, you're not bothered with communism. That's a certainty.
And Congress approved, finally. How do you measure the success of the Marshall Plan?
The people of the United States had cast the bread of mercy upon the waters of Europe. That bread meant life for the starving. It gave them strength to stand up to communism and protect their liberty. It gave them the opportunity for their own pursuit of happiness. The American people shared their blessings.
Mr. President, wouldn't you have liked that same success you had with the Marshall Plan in Europe to spill over into the United States? Which was more difficult there, the war in Japan or your own war with the mothers of America?
We never did have but 1,600,000 men on the front under General Bradley in Europe, and every one of those youngsters, when the Germans folded up, the first thing they had to say was, I want to go home. I want to go home. The mamas and papas, of course, were trying to get the boys home. They were the ones that the Congress are listening to for the simple reason that most of the Congress, well, all the congressmen had to run for re-election every 2 years, and the senators, a third of them every 2 years also. And they were looking out for those votes at home. The Congress really put the heat on me. They called the chiefs of staff and cross-questioned them to see if they couldn't hurry the boys home. Churchill was telegraphing me almost daily to keep the American forces deep in the Russian zone for the purpose of containing the communists.
Weren't your former allies giving you a difficult time? Each one trying to expand its own zone of control? How did you argue them out of their appetites?
I gave up trying to persuade de Gaulle. I finally warned him that if he didn't get out of Stuttgart and Italy, that American aid would cease. He got out. I had sent Tito word that if he wanted to go into Trieste, he'd have to shoot his way in. And when Tito considered the matter very carefully, he decided that it would be better to discuss the matter at the peace table rather than take a chance on having the Allies take him to town, although I'd been very much pleased to do it. When the war ended in Europe, I had 12 million problems that I dumped in my lap. 3 million of them were in Europe, and they had assisted in breaking the greatest war machine the world has ever seen.
You still needed men in Europe to work out the peace.
And of course, we still needed them to finish the Japanese war and do several other things that were necessary to be done.
Yet, right in the middle of this war, the Army was already demobilizing. I guess the mothers were winning.
It wasn't demobilization at all. It was disintegration.
I remember the tremendous signs on the docks and the streets and the homes. Welcome back.
The veterans looked at other signs around also. There had been no apartments or houses constructed since 1940 to speak of. And when they came home, they couldn't find any place to live. A lot of them couldn't find jobs. And it was a very, very ticklish situation. Many of the men in the armed services had postponed marriage until the war was over. Now, I didn't need to be reminded of the dangers because I had some personal experience of depression after the First World War.
Creating employment was a major effort then. You were certainly the friend of labor throughout the years, yet in your presidency, you were vilified by the labor leaders more than any other president in recent history.
All my life, I've fought for the rights of the working man, but no man has a right to put his rights above the welfare of the country as a whole. 1946, John Lewis and Elvady Johnson called out 700,000 men in the coal mines and on the railroads. And calling out that 700,000 men was hurting 150 million people in the United States, and I don't know how many in Europe. The people of the country were very angry at this situation, and Congress is in a mood to take away every right that labor had won for itself over the last years. I had to get those mines and those railroads back in operation by any means I could possibly employ, even if it meant breaking the strikes. I had been elected by the friendly relations with the labor movement of the country, but I was also a servant of 150 million people of the United States, and I had to do the job, even if I lost my political career. I told them if they thought they were going to tie the country up on its transportation business, come hell or high water, I'd see that they didn't get it done. I applied to the Attorney General for an injunction and got it, but Lewis paid no attention to it. Lewis had a notion for quite a long time that he was bigger than the government. Well, in this instance, he was arrested, brought him up for trial for contempt. He was fined $10,000, and his union was fined $3,500,000, and they finally had to pay $700,000 of that, and I think Lewis paid his own whole $10,000. It was a lesson that he had to be taught, that the President of the United States is the head of the government, and that no miners' union or any other kind of a union or no organization of employers can run the government of the United States as long as it's under the Constitution as it's now set up. Well, after these heavy fines, Lewis called his strike off and spent a great deal of time telling his miners exactly what he thought of me, and it wasn't printable either.
Let's leave John L. Lewis, and let's talk about the farmer.
I knew about the problems of the farmers, for I spent the best 10 years of my life running a 600-acre farm, and I knew something about it. Even after I became a United States Senator, I found that only one farm in 7 had electricity. Millions of farms, small farms particularly, had no electricity, no running water, no indoor plumbing or anything of the kind that people thought were necessary. The question is, what makes a man into a communist? It's not difficult. You take a situation where there is plenty of everything, and he has nothing. He has no money, no property, very little education, and no chance whatever to get the things that he thinks he ought to have. He lives in abject poverty. There's plenty of food, clothing, and everything for everybody but him. And he lives without anything whatsoever that the man ordinarily has to have. In addition to that, he has no hope for the future. When I was in the United States Senate, I did everything a man could do as a United States Senator to get something done about this. When I became President of the United States, I made up my mind that I was going to do something about it, and I went to work to try to get it done. The old bugaboo of socialism and communism would be aimed at me if I started a fight like this. But we had to do something for the farmer. We had to do something that especially helped the little farmer, and it occurred to me that the Brannan Plan was the proper way to get it done. And I was willing to go ahead with it and do the very best I could with it. The federal government had done a great deal for the big farmer, but very little for the little farmer. They'd helped the big farmer by buying his surplus and paying him to keep his land out of cultivation, but in my opinion, the small farmer had been completely overlooked. I was absolutely convinced that the federal government had a duty to the small farmer as well as the great one. the worker was protected, I wanted the farmer protected in exactly the same manner. I had a plan in view which had been worked out with the assistance of my Secretary of Agriculture, Charlie Brannan. It was known as the Brannan Plan. And I was sure if we could put that into effect, the small farmer would be taken care of and we probably would skip a depression.
The Brannan Plan then was basically to cut down subsidies to the large farms. You were taking on a pretty big opponent.
I knew if I sent the Brannan Plan to the Congress, I'd be in a fight with the lobbies. They didn't want it to happen. They weren't going to let it happen if they could possibly help it. They would do everything they possibly could to beat me. They'd make a campaign against me when I ran for office the next time. And they had tremendous funds with which to organize a real political fight. Hearings were held on the Brannan Plan, and many, many witnesses turned up to be heard. Who were they? Representatives of the National Association of Manufacturers, representatives of the Chamber of Commerce, representatives of the Rich Farm Bureau. Those kind of people, the ones who loved the farmer so much they wanted to put him out of business. But I knew what the farmers were thinking and what the farmers want. I had talked to thousands of them in the campaign of 1948, and I was satisfied that they wanted the Brannan Plan. So I sent the Brannan Plan to Congress.
Well, you lost that battle. The Brannan Plan was defeated, wasn't it? But you did use the farm produce to help feed the needy all over the world. That kept prices up.
The terrible tragedy in connection with this situation was that there were millions and millions of people all over the world starving to death because they didn't have enough to eat. It was necessary that something be done to meet that situation. I got to thinking about the matter, and I remembered that former President Hoover had fed the starving people in the First World War for President Wilson. I called President Hoover up. He was at a hotel in Washington, and asked him if he'd come down to see me. Well, the telephone girl didn't tell him who was calling, and I said, "This is Harry Truman." Oh, he says, "I'll come right down." So he came down, and I said, "Mr. Hoover, I've got a situation which you met and solved one time. I want you to do the same thing for me." And he sat there about a minute and said, he said, "Yes, Mr. President, I'll do it." And he got up and walked out. And I said to Strauss, "What did I do? Did I hurt the feelings of the former President of the United States?" He said, "No, you didn't hurt his feelings. You just prolonged his life 10 years. And I told him that there was $1 billion behind him if he wanted to use it, and the whole power of the government of the United States. He didn't use more than half of that $1 billion, but he accomplished the purpose. And I think it's one of the best jobs I ever did." But I had a lot of Democratic friends who didn't think it was very good. I was down in Texas one time making a speech at Waco with Sam Rayburn as the presiding officer. And Sam said, "I never was mad at you once." And I said, "What the hell are you mad at me about? You didn't have the business to get mad at me." Well, it says you brought Hoover back to life.
Let me turn our talk from life to the subject of death. At the end of World War II, you were described with the great venom as not being sufficiently vindictive against those who ran the German concentration camps.
The Nazis had a murder squad, all of which were volunteers. They called them the elite, or the SS outfit. And they were the ones who were employed for the purpose of doing the murders that the Nazis wanted. They were volunteers, and they only accepted men who were heartless and who were willing, without provocation, to shoot people down and murder them in any other way, burn them up in a furnace if it was necessary. You know, a lot of people never forget history, and they never learn anything from it. We weren't going to make that mistake. In the first place, in 1928, at the old League of Nations, the Kellogg Pact had been signed and agreed to, clearly and finally outlawing the aggressive war. Germany was one of the signers, and so was Japan. At Tehran, Stalin offered a toast to the punishment of all war criminals. And he said that there were at least 50,000 of them. I also offer a toast to the firing squad, he said. Punishment should not be meted out without a trial. The trial was what I was fighting for. I wanted to make it impossible for anybody to say that this was just a lot of propaganda, that it didn't happen, that it was a pack of lies. I wanted to fix it so things would be down in black and white, and the evidence would be available for future generations, just like it was to us. That was the reason I wanted trials. I wanted to see that these atrocities, such as this, were punished. I was being attacked from all sides for insisting on trials. Some of my best friends went back on me in that line. The newspapers also joined in the attack. I didn't want the same thing to happen to Hitler that happened to Napoleon Bonaparte. You see, Hitler was called the Beast of Berlin. Napoleon was called the Ogre of Corsica. He was exiled to the island of St. Helena, and it gave him an opportunity to make a hero out of himself by writing his viewpoint of what took place. I didn't want that same thing to happen to Hitler. I didn't want Hitler to have a chance to be made a hero by future generations, because he was anything but that. He was the greatest murderer in the history of the world. Well, I thought the leaders should be punished in proportion to the terrible crimes they had committed. But I didn't think you ought to be just rounded up and shot without a trial. That is just plain revenge. Then at the end, all the Allies saw what Hitlerism boiled down to. Corpses, dead people, piled in rows, just like cordwood. I knew what war was, but it had never been like this. And I was determined, if it was the last thing I ever did, to let the whole world know just exactly what had been happening. We were collecting the evidence. And believe it or not, the Germans were helping. They had kept all kinds of records of what they had done. Pictures, movies, all sorts of things that showed just exactly what they were doing. Even the Pentagon got into the act. Some of our high brass got into the picture because they were very much afraid that if anything happened to the general staff of the Nazis and the Italians, that their turn might come someday when they were in command. But we weren't trying the brass of Germany for their ability as soldiers. We were trying them for the savagery which they had allowed to take place during the war. Is it just? Is it law that the soldier who pulls the trigger or shovels the people into ovens shall be tried for murder, and the commander who orders him to fire and the head of the government under whose activities and directives they both act shall be immune? Justice is not so blind, and law is not so futile as that. England wanted the firing squad. I asked Prime Minister Anthony Eden to come to see me. He came, and I gave him a forceful statement on our attitude toward the trial of the war prisoners. I finally told him that he had German war prisoners, and so did we. He could handle his in his own way, and we'd give ours the trial of justice and let history decide which one of us had done right. Mr. Eden came around eventually to our way of thinking after he'd studied the matter over. Of course, this procedure had never been tried in the history of the world because it has been the custom of the conquerors to lay waste to the country they took and hang as many of the people and shoot as many of them as they could and rob all the rest. But the objective of this was to set a precedent so that wouldn't be done in case of another war. Never again can men say, I was following orders. And never again can men in power give such orders. It is a precedent which will last in history.
Millions of Jews had been exterminated. Hundreds of thousands were still alive yet, trying to move into Palestine, the nation later called Israel.
No problem I faced while I was President of the United States was more controversial or more complex than the problem of Israel. In 1948, I was up to here in experts from the Army, the Navy, and the State Department. I had to take a look at myself for the simple reason I was trying to find out why a Midwest Baptist like me should get so emotionally upset over Palestine and the fate of the Jews and their terrible position in the world. I knew how they felt. My grandmother and my mother have told me many stories about what happened to the people who lived between Kansas and Missouri, how they were moved off their homes, as many goods and chattels as the Federal soldiers thought they ought to have, loaded into a wagon and taken into town, where they had to stay all the time while the war was going on. I had some notion of what these people were going through who had to be moved from one place to another in order to have a home. And I was very anxious that they would not and should not have to go through the same sort of difficulties that the families in the war between the states had to go through. It was my attitude that the American government couldn't stand idly by while the victims of Hitler's madness were not allowed to build new lives. Hitler had been murdering Jews right and left. It's estimated that he killed 6 million Jews and burned most of them up in furnaces. It was a horrible thing. I saw it, and I dream about it even to this day. And on that account, the Jews needed some place where they could go. Some way had to be found to take care of those displaced persons, give them a place to live, something to eat, and something to wear. And it was up to us to try to get it done.
The English, they needed oil badly, were in no hurry to leave. British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin said, "The Jews have waited 2,000 years for a homeland. A little more time shouldn't matter."
That is a pretty raw, ignominious thing to say. When Bevin made that statement to me, and he added to it another statement that if I had not meddled with the thing, they would have had the thing settled. So that didn't help my Missouri good nature one little bit. May the 14th, 1948, the British mandate was on the point of expiring, and the British had made up their minds that they would not follow through. The Arabs and Israelis were all ready to go to war. Well, meddling or not, I thought there ought to be one more try to avert war. I thought that the United Nations was the proper place for this thing to be handled. Warren Austin was our representative at the United Nations, and he was against the Jewish program almost entirely. And I called him up at the United Nations and told him exactly what I wanted and explained the whole situation to him. And he asked me some questions, and we discussed the matter back and forth. And after he knew what all the facts were, that was the right thing to do, he said, "Well, Mr. President, if you want it, I'll do everything I can to put it over." The vote was coming up in the United Nations for the petition of Palestine, where this should be divided into Jewish and Arab states. There was no other basis. We had to divide the thing into two countries. I wrote to an assistant as follows: "I surely wish God Almighty would give the children of Israel an Isaiah, the Christians a St. Paul, and the sons of Ishmael a peep at the golden rule." We had just finished 2 wars, and we had a country of our own to put back on an even keel. I guess that's when I began to feel that the presidential chair was about the loneliest place that a man could be. And if you think that the president has somebody to pass the buck to, you're just as mistaken as you can be. I had a sign on my desk that the buck stops here. It couldn't get any further. I gave orders that nobody was to come to see me and talk about the Palestine affair. Dr. Cham Weitzman had been trying to get in all along, and I wouldn't let him in. But someone did come to see me, and he got in. His name was Eddie Jacobson, one of the finest men I ever had anything to do with. And he and I completely understood each other, and we offset each other. He was one of the best buyers that ever I came across, and I was one of the best salesmen that he ever had to be associated with. He came in, he stood around, didn't say very much, was as quiet as he could be. And I finally said, Eddie, what in the world's the matter with you? Have you at last come to get something? Because you never have asked me for anything since I've been in the White House and since we've been friends. And then he told me that he thought that I ought not to keep Dr. Weitzman out of the White House. He thought I ought to see him. And I told him that I would see the doctor, but he'd have to bring him in the side door. I didn't want any propaganda started on the thing. Dr. Weitzman's first name was C-H-A-I-M, and I didn't know how to pronounce it, so I called him Cham, called him that to his face, and he liked it. He was a wonderful man, one of the wisest people I think I ever met. He was a leader, one of the kind that you read about and seldom see. Dr. Weitzman came to see me. We had a long, long conversation, and he explained the situation from his viewpoint, and I listened to him very carefully. And at the same time, I sent for Eddie Jacobson, and they both sat down and talked to me for a long, long time. When we were through, I said, all right, you two Jews have put it over on me, and I'm glad you have, for I like you both. On my desk at the White House, I used to keep a quotation from Mark Twain, which said, always do right. This will gratify some people and astonish the rest. These young Israeli men call themselves amateur soldiers. Really, they are farmers principally, and with a great many industrial workers among them. They are very brave, able soldiers, and they surprised the whole world by turning out to be as good fighters in the field as they were good talkers on the floor. Of course, now it's history, but in spite of all the advice against it, I chose to recognize the de facto government of Israel. This was done on the 15th of May, 1948. I felt that we were rather the conscience of the free world, and that's the reason why I so promptly recognized the new state of Israel.
Was that all there was to it, Mr. President? You were concerned about this persecuted minority, and you just about committed political suicide, you, a Southerner, for another minority in America.
I come from a southern state, the state of Missouri, which is known as the state that caused the Missouri Compromise. In that state, the freed slaves were in a comparatively degraded position. Both of my grandparents, previous to the war between the states, owned slaves. And my mother died an unreconstructed rebel. I was bringing her to the White House. She was about 92 or 3 years old at that time. My brother said to her, I'll tell you one thing, Harry's only got one extra bed in the White House, and you'll have to sleep in Lincoln's bed. She said, you tell Harry if he tries to put me in Lincoln's bed, I'll sleep on the floor. And she would have, too. There wasn't any ifing around about that. When you hear words and phrases too often, they begin to lose their meaning. I had to give meaning to such phrases as all men are created equal. Making a difference whether he was a Jew, Protestant, a Catholic, or a Negro. He had a right to the protection of what the Constitution guarantees. The Constitution of the United States is said to be colorblind and doesn't tolerate classes among the people of the United States. A lot of people don't understand that. It's a good thing if some of these people would study the Constitution just a little bit. A man always should do what he thinks is right. If he does what he thinks is right and carries through, it's all right. When I was growing up as a boy between the age of 6 and 12, we had, as we usually do in towns the size of Independence, our woman who did the washing. And sometimes when my mother was sick, she did the cooking for us. She was the kindliest person you ever saw in her life. And she had three kids, 2 boys and a girl, 3 boys really and a girl. And we treated them just like they were members of the family, although it was not on an equality basis as visualized by these northern New Yorkers who don't know anything about the southern attitude toward the colored people. When I was old enough, I wanted to join the National Guard when I was 18 years old, which is the law in Missouri at that time, and is yet, I think. But when I got that pretty blue uniform with a red cord 40 gear on my shoulder, I looked like $1 million, I thought. So I put on that uniform and went out to see this old grandmother of mine. And she looked at me like this, and she said, "Harry, that's the first time a uniform of that color's been in this house since the Civil War. Don't you bring it back here." And I didn't. When I was lucky enough to become, or unlucky, whichever way you want to look at it, to become President of the United States, it came to me that I was the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces and that I could order them to integrate as their Commander-in-Chief, and they would have to do it. I realized that this first step would be a long, long march in the uphill fight for civil rights. I also knew that it might also be a march over my political grave, but that didn't count with me. Look at some of the facts which my committee revealed to me. In the Army, less than 1 Negro in 70 is commissioned, while there is 1 officer for approximately every 7 white enlisted men. In the Navy, there are 2 Negro officers in a ratio of less than 1 to 10,000 of enlisted men. The Marine Corps has no Negro officer. The Coast Guard Academy never admitted 1 Negro in its history. That's some record to be proud of, I'd say, and I was going to cure it if I could. Every decision that I ever made came out for one reason: the importance of the individual. That's the reason I hate communism and communists so. The individual means absolutely nothing to a communist. Well, you can understand in 1946 how my family, most of my friends, felt when I made it a point to implement civil rights as far as I possibly could. As President of the United States, I was Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. If we were going to have a civil rights program, the best way to start was to start where the President had the power to act. If you don't think I got a good cussing for that, you're crazy as hell. On February the 3rd, 1948, I issued instructions to the Secretary of Defense to have all instances of discrimination in the armed forces eliminated. Executive Order number 9981, and this is what it said. It is hereby declared the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunities for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, creed, or color, or national origin. Well, with this, I took my political life in my hands, and now it was up to the people to decide what they wanted to do about it. Despite all the propaganda to the contrary, the people of the United States are tolerant, friendly, and warm to everyone, and are very anxious that everybody should enjoy the freedoms under which they live. When I was re-elected, this resounding voice of the people made it very clear that I'd been on the right track. They let it be known without question that they wanted a man for President of the United States who believed in the Constitution and who would help to enforce it and make it work.
Before they let it be known at election time, Mr. President, you had to give them hell.
I was in Albuquerque, New Mexico, making a speech on this campaign, and some big-voiced, bull-voiced bird way up in the corner of that 7,000 people auditorium said, "Give them hell, Harry." Well, I never gave anybody hell. I just told the truth on these fellows, and they thought it was hell. That's all there was to it.
Your campaign to win the election in 1948 was certainly an amazing political coup. Everything was against you, and yet you fought. Did you figure you had the angels on your side?
If the angels were on my side, they were about the only ones who were. From Time magazine, I learned that I was awkward, uninspired, and above all, mediocre. Well, Mr. Gallup's polls assured me that I'd gone from an approval of somewhere around 70% of the total population just after I became President of the United States to the neighborhood of 36% in the spring of 1948. I had to move out of that neighborhood. But to tell you the honest truth, I don't give a damn about posters.
I guess you don't, because right in the middle of all this, you decided, against a lot of argument, to build a new balcony on the White House.
This time I was reminded that I was only a temporary tenant in the White House. And I reminded everyone who was interested in the subject that every tenant of the White House is only temporary. I didn't understand exactly what all the fuss was about. All innovations in the White House usually cause trouble. When Millard Fillmore was president, Mrs. Fillmore insisted on putting a bathtub into the White House. And you never saw as much fuss as raised about it. You ought to read the papers about that day and what a terrible thing it was. But they even threatened to lynch her for putting that bathtub in the White House. Beat that if you can. But they never could catch up with Ms. Fillmore, so they didn't get to lynch her. And I'm darn glad they didn't, because I put a lot more bathtubs in there when I rebuilt the White House.
Getting back to the Gallup poll, how did you yourself think you stood?
4 months before the Democratic Convention, I had to make certain decisions which affected the welfare of the country ahead of the welfare of the party. That usually is political suicide. One of those decisions concerned Palestine. The other one concerned civil rights. They were rather unpopular, and they cost me votes. But a few votes seemed to me to be little enough to pay for what was right. That was one of the things that was bothering the boys who were still fighting the Civil War.
At the Democratic Convention, your own running mate, Senator Barkley, made the keynote speech, and for the first time in convention history, did not predict victory. The southern states walked out in the Democratic Party. They started the States' Rights Party. The liberal Henry Wallace, who had also started his own. And then, when the Democratic Party could not get General Eisenhower to run on a Democratic ticket, they settled on you. What other impossible hurdles were there?
With Thurman running on the states' rights ticket and Henry Wallace running on the progressive ticket, the Democrats appeared to be hopelessly split. And that's the reason they all thought I didn't have a chance to win. Dewey and Warren had all the money that was necessary, and my campaign fund was about like Mother Hubbard's cupboard. When the contributions did come in to the campaign fund, they were just a trickle, very small and not much of it. And some of the influential Democrats made up their minds that the best thing they could do would be to stay out of the picture. One of those was Bernard Baruch, who used to sit on a bench across the White House and tell people how he told presidents what to do. But he never told me what to do, and he wasn't for me. And so, when the time came to count the noses, he was on the other side of the fence and doing something else. Even Mrs. Roosevelt had a terrible time making a statement in my favor.
Your answer, of course, was the now famous Whistle Stop Tour. You spoke to 2 million people across the country. We know about the success. What about the negatives of the trip?
I did a funny thing, or a stupid thing, really, at the airfield in Cary, Idaho, when I was dedicating it. I misread the name of the person to whom we were dedicating the airport. The name was Wilma. I thought it was William, so I dedicated the airport to William, and that was whispered to me that it was Wilma and not William. And I made the same sort of a mistake with her. I said she was a gallant gal who died fighting, and the only way she died, she was out joyriding with her friend in his airplane and fell down and killed them both. We went on a little further, and I did some more talking out of turn and made the statement that I thought Stalin was a pretty good fellow, that I never had any trouble with him. And if you don't think a newspaper man made a field day out of that, you're mistaken. I afterwards, of course, had to take it back because Stalin wasn't any count. Then the greatest campaign that I'd ever been through was ended. I went home, sat down, rested a while, then went over to Excelsior Springs and went to bed, forgot all about the whole thing. The boys told me once in a while, they'd wake me up and tell me that there was some report on the thing. At 6 o'clock I was defeated, at 10 o'clock I was defeated, 12 o'clock I was defeated. 4 o'clock I'd won the election. And the next morning, the morning after that in St. Louis, there was handed this paper which said, Dewey defeats Truman. Of course, he wished he had, but he didn't, and that's all there was to it.
Mr. President, I must remind you finally of Mrs. Roosevelt's statement after the election. She said, and I quote, "I am glad of this opportunity publicly to congratulate President Truman on his election. There has never been a campaign where a man has shown more personal courage and confidence in the people of the United States. He certainly owes nothing to newspapers, to radio commentators. What he has done, he did himself." Unquote. Your courage, Mr. President, in helping another American minority, the Puerto Ricans, almost got you assassinated, didn't it?
I was taking a nap one afternoon in the Blair House, where we were living while the White House was being repaired, and was awakened by a lot of noise out on the street. And Mrs. Truman came in and said, "They're shooting our guards." Oh, I said, "It's just a backfires." And I stuck my head out the window and said, "What's going on down there?" And when I went downstairs and met the chief of the Secret Service, Jim Riley, he said, "Mr. President, have you ever been in an air raid?" I said, "Yes, been in many one." Well, he says, "Was it customary to run out and look up when they sounded the air raid siren?" I said, "That's all right, Jim. I needed this gold and you've given it to me." They had tried to kill me, and I knew that they'd try it again. I knew who they were. They were a bunch of fanatics that wanted an independent Puerto Rico. They wanted to influence a decision that was to be made on the government of Puerto Rico. When I came into office, there were three things that we could do for Puerto Rico: independence, statehood, or leave them just as they were. At the time that the situation was being considered, either independence or statehood would have been a serious program to undertake, for the simple reason that the Puerto Rican economy had gone to pot. Puerto Rico as a state would have been 5 times worse off than the state of Mississippi. It's rated as the poorest state in the Union. The so-called liberals of the big cities found out what they were faced up with. Puerto Ricans were citizens and they didn't like it. They were anxious to have Puerto Rico made independent, so their citizenship would not count in these big cities where so many of them had immigrated. And they were making all sorts of trouble for me on the subject. But I would not force any sort of a government on the Puerto Rican people without they were satisfied with it and wanted it themselves. 1 year later, I signed a bill authorizing the people of Puerto Rico to elect their own governor. Munoz Marin was elected governor of Puerto Rico, and he made a great hit with the population down there by calling his program Operation Bootstrap. In fact, he was trying to indicate to the people that by their own bootstraps they could lift themselves out of trouble. I know just how those people felt when they got their own little piece of land. When I was a youngster, my father bought a farm not far from the city of Independence where he lived to go to school, and I know just exactly how those people felt when they got a piece of land of their own that they could call home. In 1950, the Congress of the United States passed a law, number 600, I think it was, authorizing a referendum in Puerto Rico as to whether they would write their own constitution or not. A Commonwealth Association was provided for in the bill, and the people had to decide whether they wanted to continue the Commonwealth situation or not, although they'd been living under that for quite some time. Now, I've always been in favor of self-determination for the people, but when I saw that bill on my desk, I had some qualms. I wondered what the world would think if the people in Puerto Rico voted no on that proposition that I was going to put up to them. And I just wondered what sort of a propaganda machine the communists would start up if they could say that to the world that the Puerto Ricans were tired of American exploitation and an American control of their island and voted us out. I thought many days about these things, and then I thought I'd take a chance and go ahead and sign it, and I did. You would have thought under the circumstances that I'd set off a dynamite bomb of some kind to the rest of the world.
It was before the vote that the attempt on your life was made. The Puerto Rican people went to the polls then.
The vote was yes, by a margin of 4-1. Puerto Rico had a new constitution and free government, and they had received it through the realities of the people themselves voting on it. It was a death knell for colonialism so far as the Western Hemisphere is concerned. We like our freedom so much that we want everybody to live in the same dignity and freedom.
You felt that freedom was being threatened in Austria in 1947 because the communists were arriving there. How did you propose to protect all of Western Europe?
Let me put it this way. If you post your property with no hunting signs, you're a lot less likely to wake up some morning and find a place full of hunters who had no right to be in there. I felt if we could make it clear to the Soviets that any armed attack on our security would be met with overwhelming force, then the armed attack might never come. Everybody was tired of war. Nobody really wanted war. And we had hoped that there'd be a time of peace and that we'd have a chance to make treaties which would be kept. The objective of the Russians was to dominate the whole of Western Europe. What's more, I was well aware that the Russians were carrying off all the German experts in missile warfare. Well, if history teaches us anything, it is that weakness invites attack. I had made up my mind that to use every effort on the part of the United States to prevent the Russians from thinking that we were too weak and that they had a right to attack us. It's almost impossible to make an agreement with the Russians. They remind me of a Missouri mule. You can't make him go into a creek if he thinks it's too deep to wade across. You can't make him turn around if he doesn't want to. You can push him and you can pull him, and he's still the same contrary Missouri mule. But the Russians, they were a mule all the way through and never did change from being one. You couldn't be kind to them and get them to do anything. The only way they knew how to do anything was when you had more divisions than they did.
But you had to convince Congress as well as your allies. Senator Vandenberg was certainly against involvement in Europe again, and he was mighty influential.
During my years in the Senate, I became very well acquainted with Arthur Vandenberg. He was a great man, and I liked him very much. He had character. He was perfectly willing to take a stand. He and I were very often on the opposite sides of the fence, but it was not a personal matter. I knew he was honest in his beliefs, and I think he gave me credit for being the same way. But one of the greatest things that he ever did was to stand on the floor of the Senate and completely reverse his stand on isolationism, or insulationism as he called it, because we were willing to enter into a peacetime alliance despite our strong opposition both in the Senate and in the country. Western Europe has remained free. President Roosevelt once stated, more than an end to war, we want an end to the beginnings of all wars.
NATO was formed for protection against communist expansion into Western European nations. Wasn't the McCarran Act a domestic, in-country attempt at protection, but one which threatened our own freedom?
The McCarran Act was a vicious act. The Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the State Department all opposed it. It was a very vicious piece of legislation. It put the government in the business of thought control. But this bill was for the purpose of creating informers. In 1692, in Salem, Massachusetts, some youngsters got the shivers. Maybe they had a cold, I don't know. Anyway, they accused some of the women of the neighborhood, old women particularly, of being witches. And they executed by hanging and by the ducking stool a great many before they found out that it was all a fake, that there wasn't any such thing as a witch. But while they were doing that, a large number of women and some men suffered as a result of that period of hysteria which went through the colony at that time.
Your own community in Missouri had a formidable group still organizing witch hunts. You lost one election in your early political career. Wasn't this one of the reasons?
An officer of the Ku Klux Klan had the guts to stop and tell me that I shouldn't appoint any Catholics to any office in Jackson County while I was county judge. I told him where to go. Well, the Klan had a meeting in Lee Summit, and I went out there. There must have been 1,000 of them assembled there. I walked down through their aisle in the center of the place where they were meeting, got up on the platform and told them exactly what I thought of them. When I got through with my conversation with the Klan, and got through telling them what I thought of them, I turned around and walked down the aisle to my car, got in it, and drove away. I was on the road to Independence and got about halfway up there when I met a carload of my friends coming out, 2 carloads in fact. They had clubs and baseball bats, and shotguns and everything of the kind. And I made them turn around and go back to town and told them I was all through with the Klan and they hadn't done anything to me. My friends up there were of the opinion that they might do something that they had no business to, but I never was afraid of them because any outfit that has to work behind a sheet like these birds is not dangerous. He's a coward, or he wouldn't cover up his face.
The same mob persecution of public servants was taking place during this time, the time called the McCarthy era.
People in the government were being fired on the most flimsy of excuses. A great many of them absolutely unjustly. I had to do something about it. Well, what I was after was security, but not at the price of injustice.
As I recall, the charges were not only against communists or supposed communists, but that there were many homosexuals in the State Department.
There was a senator down in the department. He had one of the employees of the government up there, and he said to this fellow, "What department are you in?" He says, "I'm in the executive department." The senator said, "That's not specific enough. Whereabouts are you employed?" He said, "In the State Department." The senator said, "What's your politics?" He said, "I'm a communist." He says, "You mean that you admit that you're a communist right here in public?" He said, "Yes, I have to be one or two things. I prefer to be a communist."
What was the attitude of Congress generally?
They passed this McCarran bill and sent it to my desk. When the bill came to me, I was very sure that I would be in considerable amount of trouble because I would be roundly abused if I vetoed it. It was a bill, in my opinion, that has passed through fear, needless fear. I vetoed the bill.
That didn't help. Congress overrode your veto, and the McCarran Act became a law.
What happened was a shame. There was more than 1 million names reported in this spasm that the country had at the time. It was a terrible thing and should never have happened. The McCarthy outfit never did get enough evidence to convict a single person or to even have a single person tried. Communism, however, is a real threat. But there's no danger of communism upsetting this government from within. Communism grows out of human misery and poverty. Get rid of misery and poverty, you're not bothered with communism. This great country of ours can survive anything, even panic, if we don't lose our heads and throw away the one thing that makes the country great, and that's our freedom. So I've never had any serious worries about communism doing anything from within in this great country of ours.
One of the reasons for the exceptional fear in America was the memory of the Berlin blockade in 1948. There in Germany, you used a now famous airlift in another kind of show of strength.
3 years after VE Day, the Russians and the Americans were facing each other at Berlin. The Russians had made up their minds that they would run us out of Germany and that they would do it at gunpoint if it became necessary. Many thoughts went through my mind. How does a city blockaded from the rest of the world survive? Where does food come from?
medicine, coal for heat, and the making of electric power, raw materials for the factories. And what about milk? I was told that 6,000 newborn babies would die. The Kremlin was telling the people of Europe that the United States would back away from any military risks. Our position in blockaded Berlin was precarious. If we wished to remain there, we would have to make a show of strength. But there was always the risk that Russian reaction might touch off a catastrophe. There was always a chance that some trigger-happy Russian pilot might light a powder keg and create a situation that would cause trouble for all of us. They were all worried, everybody was worried about what would happen. In my diary, I wrote, "I have a terrible feeling that we were very close to war."
You must have had an overwhelming problem of logistics.
Generals are always pessimists, you know. And General Clay had told us we couldn't get an armored convoy through to Berlin, and I believed him. I think he knew what he was talking about. General Vandenberg said if we assembled all the planes we could get our hands on, we'd leave naked places in other parts of the world, although there was peace in other parts of the world, and we had control of the sea and the air. And I didn't see any sense in letting this thing go out the window by not trying everything that was possible.
But it worked. You flew in supplies right over the heads of the blockaders.
The longer the blockade continued, the more efficient the airlift became. And the efficiency of that airlift was remarkable. The longer the blockade continued, the more the German people looked to the West as the sole source of their freedom and liberty.
Didn't Russia rattle its own saber, threaten to retaliate?
The Russians announced that they would hold air maneuvers. And these maneuvers were being held over the air lanes which our planes were using going to Berlin. I was very much worried. On September the 26th, 1948, I decided to take up with the United Nations the Berlin case and the action of the action of Russia in Germany. The United Nations is a symbol of peace. I was always interested in the United Nations. In fact, I set it to work. And I also dedicated the building, which they use in New York City. And if the United Nations can become the symbol of peace and can enforce the peace, we'll have peace in the world continually. Otherwise, we can just look forward to a Third World War. If the United States shirks its job with the United Nations, as it did with the League of Nations, then we're in a bad fix.
September of 1948. That was mighty close to that famous election time. What effect did the campaigning have on the Berlin crisis, or the Berlin crisis have on your campaigning?
All the while I was campaigning, I was in touch with the Berlin situation. My first job was that of President of the United States, and I took that very seriously. In front of my mind were the many problems of the country, of the world, and I was troubled. Any moment, the Russians might make an irretrievable move and plunge the world into flames. But we had to go at it. As I said before, we had to meet that situation come hell or high water.
You met that situation.
On May the 12th, the Berlin blockade was
small
lifted.
Nation with no Mr.
wealth,
President, no oil, no minerals. When we speak of international relations,
little else.
somehow we always are
disastrous
discussing
war.
strife.
Power
Why did you
plays,
decide to
an
fight
insular
to
attitude.
protect South Korea? Let's talk about your offer of the most
rescue
generous gift
of South
ever
Korea
offered by
from
any
the
one
aggression
nation to the
of
world.
North Korea
And what
was
happened?
a much farther-reaching affair in November, than everybody thought it was. 1945.
In 1945,
3 months
the Russians
after the
joined the Americans and taken
bombs
over
had
Korea
been
from the
dropped on
Japanese. The
Hiroshima
Russians
and
to the north, the
Nagasaki,
Americans to the south,
and myself and the rest of the world had discovered
all the Koreans were
what a
going to
powerful
vote
source of
in a
energy
plebiscite to
the
determine
atom
their own
could
government.
be.
What
It
was the
occurred to
result
me
of
that some revolutionary approach ought to be made to the control of this tremendous energy. At that time, I made this declaration. We are prepared to share on a reciprocal basis with other members of the United Nations detailed information concerning the practical industrial
Sir,
application
allow me to
of
strike
atomic
a
energy.
personal note.
In other words, we wanted the
You were
United
visiting
Nations
at
to
the time
control
in
this for
Independence
peaceful
with your
purposes.
mother. warm,
This was a
peaceful
landmark in the
What happened?
human relations
You
of the
received
world.
the news of the
The
invasion
United
of
States
South
was
Korea
willing
by
to turn
North
over
Korea.
its control of
And you had to
atomic
make a
energy
decision.
to the United
What were your
Nations
thoughts?
for
What did you do?
the safety of the world. Of course, we couldn't turn this situation over to the United Nations without a guarantee of the proper inspection to see that it was used only for the purpose of peaceful purposes and not for war.
I gave my approval
counted on
to
the
call an
reaction of the
emergency
Manosphere,
meeting of the United Nations
Joseph
Security
Stalin.
Council to consider
This man
a
said
declaration
Russian
that
for
an
no.
act of aggression
And his
had been
representative in the
committed
United Nations
against
said
the
нет.
Republic of
It
Korea.
was an astonishing thing.
The flight back to
All the
Washington took
representatives
about
of
3
the other
hours,
countries
and
in the
I had
world
time to
sat
think
in
about
stunned
the trouble
silence when this
which
took
the
place.
communists set
They
off
all
in
expected
Korea.
that
I
the
found
Russians would
myself
agree,
thinking
and so did
that
I.
this was not the first instance in
left
modern
the situation
times
in
of
such
the
a way
strong attacking the weak.
everybody
And I
lost.
remembered how each time
like
the free
thinking of the
nations
power of
failed to
electricity
act, it
in
encouraged
terms of
the
the electric
aggressors
chair.
to pursue their imperialist aim
You say
and
that
tempted
Russia
them
just
to
did
more
not
raids
trust
on
the
their
offer?
neighbors.
You must
The
remember
communists were now
that
doing
they were
to
a devastated
Korea
nation.
what Hitler,
And
Mussolini,
they hardly had
and the
enough to eat
Japanese
for their people.
were doing in
Of
the
course,
opening
Russia
days of
felt
the Second
insecure
World
and
War.
suspicious.
And I was certain
We came
that
up
if
with a
aggressors
plan
were not
which we
stopped
thought
now in their tracks,
would revive
no
the
small
ruined
nation
world.
would have the
So I
courage to
tried again.
resist.
When the Russians
This
turned
was
down
no
the
time
first
to
proposition,
hesitate.
I made them
This
a
was no
proposition
time to
that we
falter.
go together.
This
Russia
was
and
a
the
time
United
for
States,
decision and for
and
action.
create electricity with
A
atomic
real,
energy.
honest-to-goodness
Turning up
emergency
the
comes
first plants
about,
on Russian
which
soil.
affects the safety
They
and
fooled around
welfare of
for
the
a
United
while
States.
and
The
turned that
president
down,
has to
just
act.
like they did for the United
I was the
Nations
president.
control of
I
atomic
made the order,
energy for
and it
peaceful
was
purposes.
approved by the Congress
I found
as
them
soon as was
not
possible
willing
get
to
the
enter
facts
into
to
any
them.
sort of an agreement that's for the welfare and
Surely
peace of the world,
the Congress didn't
unless
say
they
yes
can
that
control the situation.
Some of the opposition
We
in the
offered to
Congress
share our
wanted to
atomic
call it
secrets
a
was turned
war
down for at least
and
one more
bring
reason.
on all the difficulties that
In
they possibly
1949,
could so that the
an
president
atomic
couldn't accomplish the
explosion
purpose which he had
not
in
of the
mind,
United States
which was to
making
save the Korean
reported.
Republic. He even went so far as to
The
call
United
it my
States
war.
hadn't exploded a bomb
And give
in
it what they call it
1949,
long as
so
we
it could
wanted
have
and
been
kept the
nowhere but in
Korean
Russia.
Republic going,
Of
and that's
course,
what we did.
That was the principal
I
reason
have
why we couldn't
called the
make any
United
agreement with
Nations
Stalin.
police action.
It was a great
The
disappointment
first
to us,
action
and
in
particularly
the
to
Civil
me,
War of the United
for then
Nations.
I had to tell the people of the
The
United
decision
States that we
to
no
fight
longer
back
had the
against
monopoly.
aggression in Korea
We had lost our
was the first
military
firm
advantage.
statement
There was no
that the
time to
United
lose.
Nations must
I called
not
my
and will
advisors
not
in immediately
tolerate
to discuss the
flaunting
situation
of the agreements
and
and the
find out
laws
what we should do
of this
next.
vital international body.
We had by that time
And it's the idea of
started
the
work on
organization of the
the super
United
bomb,
Nations to
what they
keep the
call
peace.
hail bomb, or
And
the
when
hydrogen
the
bomb.
action was taken
And
in
some of these
Korea,
scientists didn't want to go
the
ahead
action
with
was a
it.
United Nations
Robert
action
Oppenheimer,
and a police
scientist,
action at that.
held that it was palpably
Mr. President,
immoral to build a
question
weapon of
often
such
asked is,
total
why did
destructive you
power?
not come to a final
His
peace with
colleague,
North
Edward
Korea?
Teller, on the other hand,
President Eisenhower
claimed
did
soon
soon
after
the
he
only
was
way to
elected.
ensure the peace.
We discussed the peace terms
While these
between
two
North
top
Korea and
scientists
South
were in
Korea,
disagreement,
and
the work
one of
on
the
the hydrogen
provisions
bomb
of
stopped.
those peace terms was
Until
that
you
the
found
prisoners
out
of
that
war
God's
that were in
troops
South
and
Korea,
other scientists
North Koreans,
had been handing
would be
over our
turned over
secrets
to the
Russia
North
for 7
Koreans.
years.
That I wouldn't agree to
They wanted to
because
build
they
the
had
H-bomb,
been
too.
fighting in the North Korean army
3
under
days after
duress.
the
They had been
confession
forced to
of
fight
betrayal,
there.
I
And,
said,
a great many
"It
of them
is part of
surrendered
my
of their own accord
responsibility as
to the
Commander-in-Chief
South
of
Koreans.
the Armed
And
Forces
had they gone back,
to see
I
that
was
our
very,
country
very
is
sure
able to defend
that the North
itself
Koreans
against
would
any
slaughter them all.
possible aggressor.
That
Accordingly,
almost happened.
I have directed the
Under
Atomic
the
Energy
Eisenhower peace
Commission
plan,
to continue
prisoners
its
would
work
have been turned over
on
to the
all
North
forms
Koreans.
of atomic weapons,
But the South Korean
including the
president
so-called
opened the
hydrogen
prison
bomb
gates,
or
and
super
all the
bomb.
prisoners were allowed to
that is a
escape.
sad story indeed.
General
The
Eisenhower was
discovery
elected
of
president. And he went
release
over
of
there
atomic
and
energy
agreed to what
is
the
one of the greatest
North
things in
Koreans
the
wanted
history of the world
in
for the
order, he
welfare
said,
of
to
man
bring
and the
peace in
increase of his
Asia.
power on Earth to make it a
It
better
seems,
place
sir,
to
there
live.
was another general who
Alfred
gave
Lord
you a
Tennyson
rather
said
hard
it better in
time,
1842 when he
What
wrote
kind of
that
a man
beautiful
was he?
poem, Locksley
General
Hall.
Crowdy
When I was a schoolboy
in the long
Philippine
War.
I used to carry that
And he
poem in
had
my
met
pocket all the
General
time.
Arthur
not one quote
MacArthur.
from it.
And he
I
made
dipped
a
into the
statement
future
that he thought General
as
Arthur
far as the
MacArthur
human eye could
was
see.
the most egotistical
Saw
and
the vision vision of the
self-centered
world
gentleman he'd
and
ever
all
seen in his
wonder
life.
that would be.
Until
All the
he
heavens
met
filled
his
with
son,
commerce,
who's the General
argosies
MacArthur with
of
whom we're
magic
dealing
sail,
now.
pilots of the purple
After the
twilight,
surrender treaty had
dropping
been
down
signed,
with costly bales.
I named
And then the war
MacArthur
drums
the
stopped
head
no
of
longer,
the
and the
occupation
battle flags were
of
furled.
Japan.
in the Parliament of
And
Man,
that's where
the
this
Federation of the
egotism
World,
came out.
and that's the
He
United
became
Nations
so
today.
important in his
There,
own
the
mind
common
that he thought
sense
he was
of
greater
most
than the
shall
President
hold
of the
a
United
fretful
States.
realm in all,
General
and the kindly
Wainwright was,
earth shall
as
slumber,
badly
lapped
treated
in
as
universal
any
law.
prisoner of war ever was. They knocked him around just as meanly as they could. Well, as soon as the surrender came and the Japanese surrendered, I sent a plane to pick up those imprisoned officers and brought them back. General Wainwright, of course, felt that he ought to stop by and see his former commanding general in Japan. He stopped by to see him. General MacArthur was at luncheon. General Wainwright walked in on him and started to salute and talk to him. MacArthur, instead of asking him to sit down and have lunch, he said, "General, I told you I'd see you at 3 o'clock. I'll see you at that time." Well, sometime later, I sent for General Wainwright, and I gave him a Congressional Medal of Honor. The old man stood there with tears running down his eyes, and he said, "Mr. President, I didn't think you would do this for me. I thought you would have me court-martialed." I said, "You're not the one I want to court-martial."
One of the first head-on encounters with General MacArthur was whether we should use Chiang Kai-shek's troops to help us in Korea. It's not clear to me what General MacArthur's attitude really was.
Chiang Kai-shek offered us 33,000 troops. I must admit that at first I liked the idea. I put the matter up to the chiefs of staff, and they examined the situation and informed me that those troops were not equipped, and General MacArthur then made an investigation and reported to me that we should not take them because they'd just be a burden instead of a help. General MacArthur flew to Formosa to break the news to Chiang Kai-shek that we couldn't use him and his troops. Next thing I knew, MacArthur, after posing with Madame Chiang Kai-shek, had issued one of his famous communiques in praise of her husband. Chiang Kai-shek, at the same time that MacArthur was over there with him, issued a statement in which he said there would be victory over the Chinese communists in Asia. After MacArthur's and Chiang's statements, some of our friends got the idea that we were reversing our policy, and they were very much worried about what might happen if that were the case. We had made a promise to the United Nations to confine our fight under the circumstances to Korea. I had invited General MacArthur to come home on several occasions. He wouldn't come. Something was always in the way. He just couldn't make it. But if he wouldn't come to me, I decided that I would make the trip and go and see him, because it was absolutely essential that I have a conversation with him. There were persistent rumors that the Communist Chinese were coming into Korea. I arranged things to make the trip. I brought a plum cake for Mrs. MacArthur, and for her husband, a 4th oak leaf custard to his Distinguished Service Medal. And when he came there, some of the boys said he didn't even salute me. I didn't give a damn whether he saluted me or not. What I was interested in was to get him in a position where I could talk to him. I took him over to the other side of Wake Island, sat down with him and talked to him for nearly 3/4 of an hour. And then I called a meeting of all the staff, with General Bradley and a half a dozen others of my staff present, and discussed the whole situation with him. And he assured me in no uncertain terms that Red China would not come into Korea. And I went home feeling very, very good about the situation. When I got to San Francisco, I made a speech on the subject and complimented him on what he had done and told the American people and the world that the thing was in control in the Far East and that I didn't think the Chinese were coming into Korea. And then, you know what happened. Thousands and thousands of Chinese communists came into Korea from the north, over the Yalu River, and drove our people back toward the south. We were in very, very great trouble, and I was much worried.
When we did start to push them back, the North Korean planes would maraud in the south and fly back to safety across the Yalu River. You would issued orders to our forces not to cross into North Korean territory, and MacArthur wanted to hit them where they lived.
General MacArthur and I came to grips over the thing. We fell out on that very thing. He wanted to chase these planes over the border and really fight a war here with communist China. That we couldn't stand for because Russia and China had a mutual defense pact. If we had crossed the Yellow River into communist China or bombed Manchuria, the Russians would have come to the aid of the Chinese, and that would have immediately brought on a Third World War. I remember another story about MacArthur. The discussion was about President Roosevelt. And MacArthur made the statement that the president was a man of great vision once things were explained to him. I suppose he used to do the explaining. At any rate, I had to watch the whole world and be sure that the free world was not invaded by the Russians in an endeavor to make the whole world communist.
A mighty strong faction in Congress was on the general's side. He was made bold by this backing, and he sent letters to the press complaining he should be allowed to carry the war to the enemy. You issued executive orders then, Mr. President, forbidding public statements by commanders in the field.
I never could understand why in the world he was willing to ignore the great theoretician von Clausewitz on military affairs. Clausewitz defined war as a continuation of politics by other means. The soldier, he said, must be the obedient instrument of broad national policy. And broad national policy in the United States is made by the President of the United States. Time after time, MacArthur went his own way in national politics. I was sure that that's what MacArthur was aiming for. He was trying to get himself in good with one of the big parties of the government of the United States so he could be President of the United States. He didn't fool anybody, at least of all did he fool me. Now, what I'm saying has nothing to do with prejudice against the military. When it comes to respect for our fighting forces, I don't have to take lessons from anybody. But I've got one very strong reservation about the military. In the history of the world, it's generally conceded, especially in a republic, that the military should be subject to the control of the civilian. That was the idea of George Washington. He felt that a civilian, as the head of the state, should be in control of the military, and that's the reason the Constitution calls for the President of the United States to be the commander-in-chief. Nobody wants to pull a man down when he's got a lifelong career that is an honorable one, but when the President of the United States, the authority of the President of the United States is interfered with by anybody, he's got to establish that authority. If he doesn't do it, he's not the President.
The last straw, I gather, was when General MacArthur sent a letter of complaint to the Speaker of the House, and the Speaker read it on the floor.
Well, of course, that upset the apple cart. I made a decision, and I was of the opinion that he ought to be replaced. But to make it certain I was right, I called together my key people. General Marshall, who was Secretary of Defense, Dean Acheson, who was Secretary of State, Averill Harriman, who had called on General MacArthur, and I listened to what they had to say. I studied it very carefully. General Marshall said that Congress would probably tie up our military appropriations, and Dean Acheson was of the opinion that it would create such a stir that it should not be done. I told General Marshall then to go back down to the Pentagon and look up the correspondence between General MacArthur and myself. He came in the next morning all steamed up and said to me, "Mr. President, you ought to have fired the so-and-so 2 years ago." Only he didn't say so-and-so. Only after General Marshall's report did I reveal what I intended to do. Despite the tremendous fury which I knew it would raise, I relieved General MacArthur of his command.
Weren't you also concerned that you were helping what you considered was an ambition of his?
Of course. He had in view, I'm very sure, to become the President of the United States when he found out that the President was the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. And he had to find out by the hardest way that's possible for a man to find it out. It seems that professional military men, as administrators in the White House, are not fitted for the job. The military men that we've had for presidents were not successes, I can tell you that. That was General Grant, and the very recent one about whom I'm hesitant to talk about now, but his name was General Eisenhower. MacArthur said that the chiefs of staff agreed with him, claiming that I'd forced them to agree with me. I didn't have to force them to agree with me because they were in complete agreement with me. They had helped me outline the policy and told me what the military situation was all around the world. And apparently MacArthur didn't know that there was a situation anywhere else but right where he was.
But the chiefs of staff unanimously condemned General MacArthur to the Congressional Committee.
Overnight, the infallibility of General MacArthur was shattered by his own colleagues, the chiefs of staff, and no less honorable military men than he himself. Douglas MacArthur, if he had stuck to his military duties, might well have been an occupant of the White House. The only thing barring Douglas MacArthur from the White House was Douglas MacArthur himself.
Mr. President, you called the Army led by General MacArthur the United Nations Peace Force. And this was not the first time you turned to the United Nations, though. After World War II, Iran was occupied by the United States, England, and Russia. America and England left, but Russia refused. What was she doing there?
I'll tell you what the Russians were doing in Iran. They wanted to get control of Turkey and then Greece. And the Iranian oil fields were their main objective. Oil and power and conquest. That's what they had in view. But little Iran and big America and the whole free world had another idea. The United Nations, which was to enforce the peace and protect the small nations. I knew that the Americans felt just as strongly about the United Nations as I did. They had 2 generations of young men going away to fight. This next time, it was entirely possible that the fighting would be done with atomic bombs in American villages and American cities. Every one of us made up his mind to stop that from happening. The Russians were not moving. The Iranians couldn't order them out of the country. There was only one place they could turn. The Iranian ambassador came to see me and told me what was happening in his country, and what was happening was endangering the peace of the whole free world. Let me give you the background of this terrible double cross. The Allies all had troops in Iran. We were in Iran to guarantee a supply line for Lend-Lease to Russia. But we had signed an agreement, each nation separately, with the Iranians to get out 6 months after the war stopped. Well, we got out. The British got out. But the Russians were still there. Not only were the Russians in the territory of a free and independent nation, they were there with the idea of taking over the country. When the ambassador of Iran came to see me for help, I had to make a decision. Should the United States step in and threaten war, or should the United States call on the United Nations to do the job? It's an old and standard rule. You shouldn't start a fight that you can't win. Sometimes just being right is enough strength to win a fight. And we thought we were in that position. Well, the die was cast. The Russians made the statement that if Iran were allowed to make her charges, she would permanently quit the United Nations. And that would be the end of the United Nations and all chance for peace in the world without war. Russia walked out on the free world. The hopes and aspirations of mankind were in deadly danger again. The United Nations can function in either of 2 ways. It can set up a military force
an overwhelming military force, or it can lay the whole matter before the world so the whole world can see just exactly what they're up to and what they're trying to do. From that point on, it depended on the conscience of the wrongdoer. The question was, did Russia have such fears, or did Russia have such a conscience? We moved some naval ships into the Persian Gulf, and I ordered a division or two to be sent to eastern Syria and the northern part of Iran. And I think that's really what caused the Russians to understand that we meant business, and that made them perform.
They left Iran.
The power of the United Nations was established. I am of the opinion, and I hope it'll be true, that the nations of the world are now united into an organization that'll keep the peace of the world permanently.
I'd like to come full circle to the quiet time, or the time that should have been quiet, when you left Washington and retired, when you became again Mr. Truman, citizen. The name-calling didn't stop, did it? John L. Lewis had said you were malignant, scheming, and dangerous. Robert Taft called you that roughneck ward politician.
Yes, they were talking about me. And that's only a few of the quotable things that they said. I'm used to them. I got so accustomed to being cussed and discussed, I was somewhat disappointed when it didn't happen. They called me most everything under the sun, but I didn't care as long as they couldn't prove it. But there was one thing I never expected. I'd been President of the United States for 8 years, and I didn't expect that they would summon me to Washington and charge me with being a traitor to my country.
That was after you were home, during the Eisenhower administration. In the election campaign, Senator McCarthy called General Marshall a traitor. General Eisenhower stood beside McCarthy on the platform and didn't say anything. That was what caused a great split between Eisenhower and you. What happened afterward?
When Eisenhower beat Stevenson in the election, I made up my mind that I would let bygones be bygones. It is customary for the outgoing president to give the president who's been newly elected on inaugural day a breakfast at the White House. Mrs. Truman had gone to a lot of trouble to prepare a nice meal in the White House for this purpose, and it was in the state dining room, where it isn't customary to give breakfasts. Mr. Eisenhower knew about this custom, and I was very much disappointed when he refused to come into the house, or Mrs. Truman had prepared a breakfast for him. And I don't mind people being discourteous to me, it doesn't make a bit of difference, but when they had become discourteous to the First Lady of the United States, then they were in trouble with me.
So, you were Harry S. Truman, retired. The next president of the United States shouldn't have much difficulty finding some involvement.
Programs that were presented to me were by people who were not interested in my ability, because I didn't have the ability that they wanted. But what they wanted was to promote the presidency of the United States. And I made up my mind that I would never have that happen. And so I turned them all down. And they thought there was something wrong with me and that I didn't know what it was all about and so forth. But the only thing that was wrong with me was that I had no idea of promoting the presidency of the United States for a job for me. That's all there was to it.
Did the new president offer any activity for you?
One time, Eisenhower stopped over in Kansas City at the Mulebach Hotel. And I called his suite and told his secretary, who was then acting for him, that I would like to come by and pay my respects. And the secretary said, all right, he'd call back. He never did call back, so I never got the appointment.
What would you say was the basic reason for this campaign against you personally?
Well, of course, the idea of the Republicans at that time was to discredit the party to which I belonged. But in discrediting that party, they had to discredit me. And in order to discredit me and discredit the party, they went to great lengths Well, it turned out that they aimed mighty low, a very new low for even the Republicans. The thing that was hardest for me to swallow was the implication that any man, woman, or child in the United States of America would think that I was a traitor to this great country of ours. I couldn't very well ignore the fact that I had been subpoenaed to appear before the Un-American Activities Committee of the House. As I said before, I've been accused, in effect, of betraying the security of the United States. Well, now, to put it politely, that's just a falsehood, a damn malicious lie.
You refused to answer the subpoena on constitutional grounds.
I always thought that McCarthy was one of the best helpers that the Kremlin ever had in this country. He thought he was doing the country a favor by all this hooey that he was putting out, but he was helping the Kremlin. And the Republican Party at that time decided to get behind him because they thought they could discredit the President of the United States.
At this time, you took very sick and went to the hospital. And millions of Americans let it be known that they were very worried and concerned about you. That seemed to bring the whole matter to an end.
All this proved that I could get along after that operation without a gallbladder. And one of the doctors told me very carefully that one of the principal reasons that I was able to get through was because I didn't smoke.
Now you keep busy at the Truman Library in Independence. Other than the vital archives, what do you hope to accomplish there?
I had hoped that after I left the White House, I would in some way find an opportunity to talk to the young people about the operation of the government and the function and meaning of the presidency.
And you do talk with the young people, one of whom may very well be president one day. What would you tell him?
You have to know the history and the background of all the things that have taken place in the last half century, or at least the last 100 years, maybe. And then he'll have to make the decisions when the matter's put before him, and he can't make it beforehand. You can't contemplate or figure out what can be done, especially when you're just a retired farmer from Missouri. Our President of the United States, I'd tell you.
Thank you, Mr. President.